Okay, we're live. I'm going to go to Twitter actually and send a message.
I tweeted about that as well.
There we go. Okay. I am Damien, aka Sleepy Reader, and I'm here with a very old friend of mine, Scott Edelman.
You don't have to say very old. I mean, please.
Well,
relatively
go back
old.
to the 90s, which isn't that far back for us, right? So very young friend for me. I think we met around 1990. So good to see you, Scott.
It's good to see you. And I realized for some reason I have YouTube open there.
Oh, are you hearing us talk?
You have to forgive me because I had the YouTube screen opened with us, so it was playing what we were just doing right now on YouTube while we were having it with a few second delay. So now I am with you and less confused.
We have at least one viewer. RTB Inc. has joined us. And so I've known Scott for a long time through writing circles. We were in a writers group together. You're about to publish your 100th story, right?
My 100th short story is coming out later this year in an anthology from PS Publishing, and I've got a new collection that's coming out in September called Things That Never Happened from Cemetery Dance Press.
And I have 3 of your collections that happen to be on a nearby shelf. This one's called Liars, Fakers, and the Dead Who Eat Them from your zombie phase. I think you've written a number of zombie stories.
My zombie phase has never ended. I have an entire other collection called What Will Come After, just filled with zombie stories.
Maybe that goes along with doing a podcast about eating.
Yes.
I'll get to that in a second. Here's one called What We Still Talk About, which I know has at least some kind of postmodern-ish stories in there where you consider what fiction is really about.
And that one has all the science fictional stories. I segregated them. There are a lot of people who read horror who have no interest in reading science fiction, who have no interest in reading fantasy. The Venn diagram overlap can sometimes be small. So some of the books, I've kept those separate.
I pigeonhole you sometimes as a horror writer, but that's not fair at all. And quite a graphic cover on this one. These words are haunted with that awesome Goya picture, yes.
Yeah.
Zeus not Zeus, of Kronos eating his children. So these are the 3. I probably am missing some of your books. You published so much, but I see you in anthologies a lot, and
I know my one that makes me happy is this year I was in something called The Unquiet Dreamer, which was a Harlan Ellison tribute anthology meant to sort of replicate Dangerous Visions. It had 33 stories in there, the same way Dangerous Visions did. There was an illustration for each story, and that came out last year. I think it debuted at the Dublin Worldcon, and I was just thrilled to be in there because of all the things that Harlan Ellison affected many ways he affected my life. So I was glad to be in that one. But all sorts of odd anthologies. Had a couple of stories published in Analog after 44 years of trying.
That blows my mind. You an analog writer.
Took me 44 years. Yeah, I did not think I would be an analog before I was in fantasy and science fiction or Asimov's or some of the other places, but that's just the way it turned out.
Yeah. A lot of the regular audience for my channel may not know the difference between Analog and Asimov's, but Analog is the super hard, or known to be the super hard science fiction magazine. In theory, you have to be an engineer to write for them.
Which I am the farthest thing you can imagine from an engineer.
But you were the editor of Foom, which really makes you important.
Yes, the editor. So we all just hold up copies of Foom. Here, we'll hold up.
You have some copies of
Different.
Foom.
I have a copy of Foom here. I was thrilled. This copy of Foom, since we're just rambling all over the place, even in the introduction, I was thrilled that there is a Marvel Masterworks of Dave Cockrum, I think, collecting X-Men, and I saw they used this cover that I commissioned for Foom back when I was 20 years old. Yes, 20 years old when I was editing Foom, working at Marvel Comics. So there's this one, and let's see, you have a bunch. And
I have waited, I don't know how many years to ask you, was that one boot of Captain America's purposefully having no color in it?
No, that was the one boot of Captain America that had me grimace horribly when I saw the issue came out, because those were hand separated in the office, where someone would, and for people who don't know how color separations are done, you would have multiple layers, one for yellow, one for red, etc., and you would manually print them in black. You would take it and blacken it in. It wasn't colored blue, it wasn't colored red. It was this acetate sheet is meant to be printed in blue, and you blackened it all in where all the blue is and the red and all that. And the individual who was doing that missed the boot. So no, that was a horrible flaw. And somehow they still let me do FOOM 8 after 8 to do 9, 10, 11. But no, then I always look at that and I go, can I, when it's reprinted, fill that boot in some way so that error is not there? But if you open that issue of FOOM, I believe on the very first inside cover you see me. Yes, that is what I looked like back then, with Tony Isabella sitting on my shoulder.
Was he like the devil whispering in your ear?
No, we were being terrible back then. We were making height jokes. We were horrible people back in the 70s.
Oh, he was short and you were tall?
Yes. So Marie Severin, the wonderful Marie Severin, did that character of the two of us for my first editorial, in which I mentioned that FOOM is now being edited by an editor as tall as both previous editors combined. So that's a double height joke, since it had previously been edited by Jim Steranko before Tony Isabella. So yeah, we were terrible people. I would not make such jokes about appearances these days, but
well, see, there's the type of thing, you know. I mean, I thought Jim Steranko must be 12 feet tall, but because I never saw him as a kid.
Well, we all thought things like that. I mean, that's one of the famous things that Harlan Ellison was known for saying to Isaac Asimov, that he had to explain that he evidently, when he wrote up what his first meeting with Isaac Asimov was, he said something like, "You're Isaac Asimov?" And everyone took that to be an insult. But what he was really thinking was, you know, all these stories of yours I've read, you're supposed to be this gigantic colossus with your hands on your hips striding over the world. And to see, you know, an old Jewish guy, of course, back then he wouldn't have been so old back when Harlan Ellison would have first met him. But when you're half someone's age, they always seem ancient. So anyway, that's how we felt back then.
This is just a very roundabout way to say you worked on the staff at Marvel in various positions, including editing FOOM. I think, were you also involved in the British publications?
That's what I was hired to do. I was hired to edit the British reprint books. I was hired to do that, and we are speaking, one of the reasons you're going to hear me be quite nostalgic today is we're astride 2 anniversaries. June 24th, 1974 was my first day at work at Marvel Comics, so that's only 3 days ago as we speak. And just a few days from now, July 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 50 years ago, 1970, was the first convention of any kind I ever attended, the Phil Suling 4th of July convention, a comic book convention that was held at the Saddle Hill Hotel in Manhattan. So we were talking between those. But yes, I was hired to work on the British reprint books. And even to get to that, there are many years of Fanish history, which we'll see how much of that will bore people.
Mostly about your Fanish history.
We can bore people with whatever I don't know if their comments will pop up if we get to see those, or if those are all over on Facebook and we don't see them. But
we have about 6 people watching, but Rasa from England has said hi. She's an old friend of mine, YouTube friend, and so far not a whole lot of other people, but people will be watching this afterwards. So I just wanted to make the context. You worked in the Marvel bullpen, as they call it, and you also wrote a bunch of comics, some of which are up here on the screen. And so I don't know if I first saw your name via FOOM or whether you were already writing things like Captain Marvel, or if that came afterwards.
Well, I don't know whether you were aware of any of that when you first met me, and it's unfortunate
no,
that
I wasn't. But as a child, I knew who Scott Edelman was because of FOOM and Captain Marvel and Omega the Unknown.
So you mean it was so traumatic that when we met, you didn't put it together and realize I was the same person?
At all.
Yeah, because we met on the campus of MIT when I got involved with a writing workshop, having met Risa Nelson, who was a writer from that. I guess we met at a BossCon up there when I was living in Massachusetts, and showed up, and you were there, and maybe Bob Howe was there, and Jeff Landis, and a variety of other people. So if I had remembered, I could have attempted to pull up the diaries I kept, because I do keep a near daily journal, and I could have written down, just met Damien Kilby today, and you would have learned what I thought of you, perhaps.
Well,
back
my
then, but
memory may be wonky, but it was either, in my memory, it was after you'd moved to Washington, D.C., or not to D.C. itself, but, to the outlying areas. And I was visiting you, and in your basement, we were talking about how you hated working at Marvel, and it was the worst job you ever had in your life.
Well, that wasn't when we met. That was much later.
No, that was later. But this is how all of this ties together, because other than that, I didn't really equate you with comics. But because you said you hated it, I didn't go in and talk about what a big comics fan I was.
Oh, okay.
And
that
so
was probably when I remember that basement conversation, because we were discussing Science Fiction Age magazine, which had not yet occurred, which I had just been in contact with the people, and I had just come up with the name Science Fiction Age magazine, and actually, I think I was bouncing multiple names off of you, including Science Fiction Age. And so you were there when I was explaining to you what the magazine were and who these guys were who I was approaching.
Yeah,
and,
I think there was a list of names that we wrote down, and we were discussing them.
Yeah, and we should leave the revelation as to what we were discussing about me hating my job at Marvel Comics for further into this conversation.
Oh, okay, I was
so that there's a tension and suspense in people to wonder, well, what was he talking about, and how could he have possibly said such a thing?
Well, before we go back to 6-year-old Scott Edelman, is that how old you were when you bought Fantastic Four #1, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, I bought it on the newsstand. Yeah.
We did want to just salute Joe Sinnott, the great inker and artist who came to sort of symbolize the Marvel style, I think.
Yes, and I have here in front of me my first comic book. If we can
go back.
Show me holding this up and then switch over to that. I met Joe 50 years ago. 50 years ago, this coming Friday, I went to the first comic book convention. This is the program for the 1970 Comic Art Convention. Bill Everett, the creator of The Submariner, did this. And inside, I was not yet the kind of fan who showed up with a sketchbook and begged people for autographs. So I did get Joe Sinnott. Let's see. As you can see, it says Beth Scott, Joe Sinnott. I had him sign this blank space. So that means I knew him 50 years ago today, when he was a mere lad of, what was he, 40-something. My goodness, he was far younger than I am now. And a few years later, that photograph that you put up, that you can go put up so people can see it again. One of the few times I cosplayed at a convention, I was dressed like a barbarian, had a broadsword which I stuck a rabbit on the tip of it. I am wearing a sheepskin around my shoulders, a sheepskin I once bought thinking I would make a creeper costume. I was going to dye that so I could pretend to be the creeper, and instead I was just wandering around in 1974, I think early 1974, and he happened to be there, and I took this photo with him, and this one was taken by a guy named Sam Maroney, who took a lot of photos back then. Has got a photo of me and Don Perlin at the first Marvel convention and things like this. But this is one of my highlight photos of my life. Yeah, and Joe Sinnott, who just passed away, who was one of the nicest people in the world, and as far as I'm concerned, the best inker of my childhood. He is someone who was the best inker for Jack Kirby. I know someone was saying, "Oh, I like Vinnie Coletta," and boy, there were people there who would bribe other people to say, "Please don't let my books be inked by Vinnie Coletta." Right. Extremely controversial inker at the time, and so I just loved Joe Sinnott. I'm grateful that I was there. I had a wonderful time in those early days of fandom. So yeah, a lot of people dying.
How old are you in this picture?
I am somewhere between 19 and 20 years old.
Oh, were you already on the Marvel staff then?
I believe believe I was. I believe this might have been one of the first conventions I attended after being on I'm no longer sure whether this was earlier in the year before I was hired or after I was hired, because there's another costume shot I have after I'm hired in which Jim Starlin had done my face makeup. And that one I was definitely on staff. So actually, this might be, I was on staff, I believe, for this when this photo was taken. There was a panel that had Jim Starlin and maybe Howard Chaykin and other folks on it. And I stood in the back of the room dressed like a barbarian the entire time. And there was a plant in the audience. And the audience member at some point after the people on stage were talking about the literary nature of comics and how they're going to be for adults and how they're going to do these wonderful things, this plant in the audience was supposed to stand up and say, I have a question. When is the Silver Surfer going to get his own comic? And I was supposed to move from the back of the room dressed like this barbarian and drag him out of the room kicking and screaming. And that was one of the reasons I was in this outfit. And it was it was a strange moment. It would have been probably at a creation convention in late '74. Yeah, so that's when this one was taken. This was in 1974, and I was 20 years old. That's the whole concept about what happened. I was not threatening him, but of course he managed to look appropriately abashed by a guy standing there with the sword. Yeah, someone was asking why was Vinny controversial. You can Google this, and I tweeted about it in response to someone recently. What was in the pencils often never made it into the inks. There were some inkers like Joe Sinnott who did the best they could.
Eraser a lot, right?
Yeah, well, for example, let's say there was a panel and you had 3 people in the background, and I don't know whether now just looking at the photo of Joe or looking at us or whatever, but you might have 3 people in the background, and Vinny might ink one of them, or there might be this complicated cityscape in the background, and Vinny would turn it into 3 block shapes of buildings. And some of that was due to the fact that everybody knew if a book was late and you needed someone to ink 25 pages over the weekend, give it to Vinny, he'll do it. So he took a lot of shortcuts in that way. Not all of it is his responsibility. If you go back to the work he did in romance comics in the 50s, he did some good artwork back then as a solo artist, but he got to be known as the person if it's due at the printer on Monday morning and we only got the pages on Friday afternoon, he will do it over the weekend. And so therefore a lot of artists say, oh no, please don't do that to me. I did so much hard work on these pencils. And there are cases in the Kirby Museum, if you Google Vinnie Coletta versus Kirby, that you will find comparisons of individual panels, because there are still photocopies of some of those. So that's the thing about him. And in fact, on my podcast, which we hadn't mentioned, I have this podcast where I go and interview people while we have a meal. It's called Eating the Fantastic, and it's up on the Apple Podcasts. I interviewed Mark Evanier. People might have gone to the News From Me blog that Mark Evanier does, an old-time comics guy, and he and Kirby managed to get Vinnie Coletta off his books. And in fact, people came to, I think Frank Robbins came to Mark Evanier once and said, please tell me the secret. How do I get Mark Evanier to not ink me? How do I get Vinnie Coletta not to ink me? So, he was known for someone who did that. I mean, he did those rushes, but the company, they were fine with it. Because, the books, that's the Mark Evanier one. There's Mark. We were having lunch at a deli in LA, and we spent 2 hours talking about his history of Marvel Comics. And when Jack told him the secret of I'm leaving Marvel for DC and don't tell anybody. So, so there's a lot of history of comics there as I sat down with Marv Wolfman and Jerry Conway and Mark Evanier.
I loved that episode with Mark Evanier. I've liked all of the comics ones and almost all the others. But the one thing in the Evanier one that blew my mind is he talked about how fictional many of the letters pages were. and how the letters would get edited so that they meant the opposite of what the letter writer meant.
I know he was saying that back in the old days. I don't quite remember it that way
from the DC. I think he was talking about
from the times, because I would be given one of my jobs when I had that job back in 1974. Everyone on staff did as much freelance as they did staff. I earned more from freelancing at Marvel while on staff at Marvel than I earned while on staff at Marvel, because people would say, "Oh, there are 3 comics that need letter pages. You want to write these letter pages?" I think I got $20 a letter page, and they give you an envelope full of, here are all the letters that came into this comic book, and you would read them and pick 3 or 4 of them and write answers. And I never had any trouble coming up with them. A lot of writers very much wanted to be in charge of their own letter column, and some people didn't care and said, "Oh, just have it written." So there were a bunch that I wrote back then. There's a lot of stuff I did as a freelancer, including editing Boom. Back in the old days, that I did the 4 issues of that, and you get paid separately from your staff job for having done that.
So to survive, did you basically need to do both freelance and editing to make it work?
No, I don't think I needed to survive. Back then, I don't want to say life was cheap in New York in 1974, when you could have an apartment. I think I was making $175 a week, and the rent on the apartment might have been in Park Slope might have been something like $200 or $215 a month. And I was banking a lot of money. If let's say I was making another $140 or $150 a week, these numbers probably seem very small in 2020, but when you did all that, or if I wrote I wrote fun books. I wrote a Captain Midnight action book, all those variety of things. I got $2,000 for editing one of those Captain Midnight books and writing it. So there's a lot of freelance going on. And I mean, the funny thing, just to jump ahead now, 45 or 50 years, depending on when I wrote things, I get more for reprints than I did for original work back then, because I would get something like $17 a page for writing Captain Marvel or some other comic book. And now I get more than that when they reprint Captain Marvel or the Scarecrow, or
when they put it in an omnibus or that.
Yeah. So it's just very funny to see every quarter, every 6 months, I'll get this check and I'll look down and I'll see that's more now than I got paid then for having done it originally. So it's kind of fun. But no, we just did it because we were fun. I mean, working at Marvel Comics, when I was working at Marvel Comics, you never wanted to leave. There were people such as Tony Isabella even had a sleeping bag under his desk, and so occasionally he would just sit there. Would I ever go back to Marvel is a question that's come up several times, and that is a very convoluted answer. One, I don't think I could go back to Marvel to the extent I am now the world's lousiest collaborator, in that I've had friends fiction-wise who wanted to collaborate with me for decades, people I went to Clarion with, and have said, no, I fight and die over deciding whether the semicolon is an M- or a comma. So I don't know if I'm a collaborator. And also, one of the reasons I got out of comics, and some of it we'll get into, is that I was writing a lot of things for House of Mystery and House of Secrets, and realizing I'm writing these things, they own them, the 6-page story. Why am I coming up with an idea for a 6-page story that I don't own, that when I could write a horror story and try and sell it to a horror comic, and it's all mine? And also, there were some things I had to break out of. If you read those House of Mystery and House of Secrets, and there's a House of Mystery or House of Secrets omnibus, I think I saw you got some massive 1,000-page thing. Maybe you were showing it on one of your vlogs, but
right now, unfortunately.
But some of those were reprinted, and they're all, we've got a twist at the end, meaning that's what the story was. I think sometimes you refer to it as the biter bitten. The person does an evil thing and dies. Someone has a comment here. What is it? Werewolf by lunchtime. Before I finish the story, it says, "Where's my no prize?" Okay, well.
There's your no prize.
There's my no prize. That's right. I earned this. I had to point out a mistake in a Marvel comic to earn this. So that's what you need to do to earn a no prize. Here, you want to see what's inside the no prize. there's nothing in here because it's a no prize. But
I
yeah,
didn't think they even sent an envelope, so I'm
they did. So, well,
tickled.
the earlier ones, actually, then the first one I can no longer find actually would have had an address label on it, and I earned two others that were an envelope in an envelope. I guess people were so concerned about them being pristine that they became aware of fans not wanting to be damaged in the mail, that they started to put these are, as you can see, they're sort of smaller than a normal size envelope, and they started doing that. But what was it? I lost track of what I was saying. Oh, these mystery stories where, for example, I had a mystery story about a guy who was an old man who was in charge of a merry-go-round, and the evil person who wanted to tear it down ended up, causing the old guy to have a heart attack and hide his pills or something like this. This is for House of Mystery, House of Secrets. So, of course, what's the ending? The old guy, the evil guy, ends up getting killed by the horses on the merry-go-round come to life and trampling him. So that's what a lot of those stories were. Someone is evil in a certain way and dies in a way that's related to the way in which he was evil. So there was not necessarily a formula, but there was sort of a theme to how these horror stories were, like the old great EC comics with Jack Davis, where the baseball team ends up playing baseball with the person's innards being the baselines and home plate and all that, and so it was pretty disgusting back then. And these were, that was drawn by Jack Davis, and these were much tamer, but still, that was sort of the theme of how most of those stories worked. So if you wanted to write, as I did, more complicated metaphysical horror stories, it involved, at least back then, not writing them for comics. So that was that was one of the reasons that I got out of comics. But I never intended to get into comics. That's the whole thing. Getting into comics happened by accident. So all these things happen.
So would you say you were more someone who wanted to be a writer, not someone who specifically wanted to be a comic book writer?
Well, I love comics. I ingested them. I had them memorized. There was a point where, up until the time I got my job in comics, I could have told you the placement of every panel on every page of every comic that I read up until then. It wouldn't just be, which issue Dr. Octopus at first fought Spider-Man. It would be, yeah, page 15 on the upper left-hand side is the panel where such and such happened. It was just so ingrained in me, and being able to look at panels and know immediately who the artist and inker was, and Stan Lee was just my uncle, and I just absolutely adored comics, and when I found those conventions, I was just an immediate lover of going to conventions. But even before going to conventions, I joined, the minute it was possible, I joined the Merry Marvel Marching Society. Here is my membership card for the Merry Marvel Marching Society. When I would have been 9 years old, I sent in the money to join the Merry Marvel Marching Society. This is long before there were conventions, long before I knew anybody who read comics other than, there'd be kids trading comics when you were a kid, but eventually they all give up and leave us weird, strange ones still reading comic books. The lonely kid in the corner in the lunchroom at school is at some point the only one who reads that. But I would be, writing letters to comics, getting postcards back from comics. The great Flo Steinberg, who would be the one who would answer fan mail, would write letters. I mean, here's a postcard, postmarked September 7th, 1967, from Marvel. And in the back, you can see it's signed Stan and the Gang, right? I had written a letter to Marvel Comics because I was confused. I would have been 12, or I probably wrote the letter when I was 11. I was confused.
The camera again?
I don't know. Do you remember when Daredevil, when Matt Murdock pretended to be his own twin brother, Mike Murdock? Yeah. And he would pretend to not be blind, and he'd be all jazzy and everything. Well, I wrote a letter and I said, I'm confused. Did Matt get his sight back? Can he see now? And it says, Dear Scott, and I'll hold it up, but it says, many thanks. This is the printed part. Many thanks for your interesting letter. You will probably find the information you requested appearing in a future issue of our magazine. Hoping to maintain your continued interest, we remain cordially yours, Stan and the Gang. And it says down here, P.S. Matt/Mike didn't really get his sight back. He just pretended he had it. Mike isn't supposed to be blind. And this is the kind of postcard, let's see, I have to hold it a little higher. This is the kind of postcard you would get when you would write to Marvel. I had an earlier one, which I wish I still had, but it got lost when we moved when I was a kid. I wrote a postcard probably in the first year or two of the Fantastic Four. The thing said something like, I have a headache, and I wrote a letter saying, I don't understand, how could Thing have a headache? He's super. And they wrote me back a postcard that says, well, Scott, you see, it was a super headache. So this was Flo Steinberg, who was what they would call her Argyle Friday back then. And she was answering all the fan mail, and she was mailing off the membership cards for the Merry Marvel Marching Society, which was a secret for a while, because if you look at some Marvel comics at the time, this started to appear on the covers in the background on billboards. The MMS wants you, and you say, well, what? I don't understand. What is that? And eventually they revealed it was the Merry Marvel Marching Society. Sent in the money. It's the minute I heard about it, I think it was $1 to join. I took pennies and nickels and dimes and quarters and put them in a peppermint patty box and taped it shut and shoved it in an envelope. I'm surprised it even got there. And eventually my membership card showed up, and I was 9 or 10 years old. I also ordered, I'm wearing an I Read Banned Comics t-shirt because I thought I should wear something of a comic book nature, but I wish I could wear this, which I bought at the same time. Let's see, I'm holding it upside down. I bought this t-shirt back then.
Wow, and you still have it.
I still have it, but I wore it when I was age 9. And that X-Men, of all the ones that are offered, X-Men was the one that I wanted. And but I can't wear it because it probably only just fit me when I was 9, considering I'm currently 6'4". When I was in the 6th grade, I was already 5'11", so it was tough to wear those things. But there's one other thing I'll show you just to prove my bona fides of comics. Here's Tales of Suspense number 69, which is cover dated September, so September 1965. And one of the things they did back then, if you were a member of the Merry Marvel Marching Society, they printed 25 names of new members in each comic. And let's see, I'll get my finger on my name before I point this up at the screen. Where is that, Scott Edelman? Okay. So let's see. I don't know if you can see Scott Edelman. Where does it say Scott Edelman, Brooklyn, New York? I think it's up there. Am I pointing in the right place?
I don't know if they give us good enough resolution on these live shows to see it. But
Scott Edelman, Brooklyn, New York. And to see that when you're just 10 years old is thrilling. And part of it, we'll eventually get to my burning out on comics. I sold my entire comic collection at one point. And except for an Amazing Fantasy 15, and I put in a safe deposit box and a couple other comics. And there was a point when I was bemoaning on my blog, there's one comic I wish I still had, and that's the one in which my name was printed as a member of the Merry Marvel Marching Society. And I said, I cannot remember which book it is in, because they printed thousands of names over the years. You can't just say, everybody go read every comic. I said, it was an issue that I know had the Titanium Man on the cover. That's all I remember, that there was Titanium Man on that cover. And someone whose name I apologize for forgetting contacted me and said, I found it, and I'm going to send it to you. And I said, how much can I pay you? And he said, no, you can't pay. No, I'm not going to let you pay me anything. Because it looked like, even in this condition, it was worth $30 or $40. I don't know, but at the time. And he just said, I just want to give it to you to thank you for all the comic book reading. So I have my one Marvel comic book from my entire collection that I have back then, which is Tales of Suspense.
When you were buying, sorry to interrupt, but
you wheel this, direct me wherever you want to go, because I could just yammer on for hours before I even get more than a year into anything.
You were there for the very beginning of the Marvel Universe.
No, I was not. Well, as a reader, I was,
As
but
a
I
reader,
mean,
that's what I mean, as a
yeah,
reader.
okay.
And as a kid, you were a kid as the Marvel Universe was being born. Do you have memories of how you felt about it and when you started realizing it was all interconnected? And
Oh, definitely. And I was remembered feeling, well, later on as a grown up, you feel how you were hoodwinked, and you feel some of the how it's part of Stan's ability to sell anything. Because if you go back to those old comics, let's say the first time Doctor Strange appeared in Spider-Man, and it would say something like Doctor Strange appears in Spider-Man by special permission of Cadence Industries, or by special, because they had many different titles under which they were publishing corporations due to mailing permits at the time. If you go back and look at all those old comics, they didn't all necessarily say, Marvel Comics. So you would think it was a big deal that this character crossed over with another character. So when you first started to see this happen, they usually didn't happen very often. I mean, yes, you had DC Comics, you had World's Finest, and you had the Superman and Batman were always there, and you had the Justice League. Okay, they're all there. But in a general way, DC was not this one big universe where everybody interacted with everybody all the time. So when you had people just appearing in random panels, not even crossovers, where if you read, the Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, which had everybody appear. You're reading Spider-Man, and Flash Thompson is about to take a punch at Peter Parker, and the ethereal form of Doctor Strange happens to be walking down the street at that moment, and Flash's fist goes through the ectoplasmic form of Doctor Strange, and then, oh, be gone, teenage boy, or whatever, and goes off. And just these they weren't minor, or Spider-Man, the issue where Spider-Man loses his powers, or thinks he loses his powers, he has a cold or something, and I remember him hanging. Maybe it's that same Amazing Spider-Man Annual. He's hanging from a lamp, from a flagpole, just hanging there. I've got no powers. How do I survive? And the Fantastic Four go by in their fantastic car and go, oh, look, there's Spider-Man. He's waving at us. Oh, he's just playing. And they go on, and he's just there for 2 panels. And this universe that they put together where people were just popping up, not even for book-length team-ups, but just little minor things that were happening now and then, really gave you a tremendous sense that it was a universe. And also, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. The Marvel Universe was New York. Spider-Man lived in, I'm going to be terrible, was it Long Island City? It was in Queens somewhere. I'm blanking out now. I apologize. Maybe, I don't remember if it was Flushing or Long Island City or what it was. Someone will slap me for that. But, there's a sense that this was happening here. And that's why one of my favorite comics is Fantastic Four #11, half The Impossible Man and half the Fantastic Four answer reader letters. And in fact, when I did an essay, there was a site called, I can't remember if it was High Low, Highbrow, just a site about high and low pop culture. And they wanted to do something on my favorite Jack Kirby panel. And I did it on a panel in Fantastic Four #11 where the Fantastic Four bump into kids pretending to be the Fantastic Four. There's some guy who has long boards on his hands with gloves pretending to be Mr. Fantastic and everything. And I had this feeling that at any moment I could turn the corner and there would be the Fantastic Four, there would be Spider-Man swinging by. And that was a special magic to me. And in addition to the regular Marvel Universe aspect, the idea that, that there they were in New York. And it never occurred to me, the one thing that didn't occur to me is, wait a second, we're in New York. My dad works in New York. Madison Avenue is in New York. 625 and 635 Madison Avenue in New York. I walked past Madison Avenue. I could have said, hey, let's drop by and visit them. It just never occurred to me, even as I was writing fan mail to Marvel Comics, that it was just a subway token away and I could have just shown up at the office. But, I never did that. And therefore, I never met any of these people until that first comic book convention in 1970, which I only even found out comic book conventions existed because a guy named Mark Hannerfeld, who people will know, even though they don't know his name, from having read DC mystery books, because you have House of Secrets and you have House of Mystery, and you have the two hosts, and you have Abel and Cain. And if I'm remembering the names correctly, Abel was the short, fat one. Am I correct? And Cain was the tall, thin one. Mark Hannerfeld was the model for Abel. So when you read that guy with the short, round guy with the beard, that was based on Mark Hannerfeld. And so Mark Hannerfeld published a series, a text instead of a letter page, something called The Wonderful World of Comics. And he said, there are fanzines, you can put a quarter on an index card and mail off the quarter and get these. And I got On the Drawing Board, and I got Comic Crusader, and it mentioned the upcoming 4th of July convention in 1969, to which I ended up not being allowed to go because I was only 14 years old. And so therefore my first convention was not until 1970. I did get the program book, which I still have, the program book for the 1969 comic convention, which has a whole schedule on it, and so forth. Oh my goodness, my Spider-Man story, my Captain Marvel stories were in the Brazilian Spider-Man reprints, I'm being told by a commenter. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
I probably made more sense in Spanish than I did in English, I'm sure, considering how well I was writing at the time. So I never made it to the 1969 convention because we always went away for the 4th of July holiday to a bungalow colony, and they wouldn't leave me at home. And so therefore 1970 was the first convention I ever went to, and the first time I walked into a dealer's room and saw Golden Age comics for sale, and saw original art being for sale, and met folks like Joe Sinnott, who I showed you his autograph I got at that first convention. And I think the other person I met back in the old days, I think I have Dick Giordano's signature somewhere in here as well. As I'm looking down, I can't remember what page it's on, but he was the other person. But yes, Dick Giordano signed my page. So those are the only two people I can guarantee I met 50 years ago this coming 4th of July weekend. And I should now pull up, since we've managed to make it all the way until I'm 15 years old as I move ahead, but this is the poster which hangs on my wall, and I'll tilt it in such a way so there's no glare. This was the poster for the 1970 convention, comic art convention, run by Phil Suling, the man who gave birth to the direct market. And it's a poster by Gray Morrow. It's actually signed by Gray Morrow. And it's on my wall because 50 years ago this weekend is when my life changed. I would not be who I am now had I not gone to that convention. So it is up there with a variety of...
Shaped you as a fan of all kinds of things, I suppose.
Well, many things. One, it taught me, wait, there are other people like me. It's not just me and maybe one other kid in school. I could go to a convention and have hundreds of people. Wow, a convention, there are actually 250 people here. My goodness, that you could have 250 people there back in the day. Someone's asking what music I listened to. The first thing I ever bought with my own money was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but I normally just put on AM top 50 or top 100 radio and listen to whatever the pop music they were playing at the day. As the littlest kid back then, when I was first given a radio of my own. But now 175,000 people at a San Diego Comic-Con I went to, and when I look at the first comic book convention I was at, this is the entire membership list of that first convention.
They could fit everybody.
146 members and 52 supporting members. But of course, when you look at it, who are the members here? It's got Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and Duffy Voland, it's his fault I got a job in comics, and we'll get to that. That'll bring us all the way up to 1974. My goodness. And it's just filled with people who came to... my future sister-in-law is on this list as a member as well. So Mark Evanier is on this list. So they're of the 140 6 members. So it
So
was an amazing.
Irene was not there.
No,
your
she
future wife.
was there, but I think she went at the last minute. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, I did not meet my wife, as strange as it is, even though we were together in 70, 71, 72, 73. I did not meet until I started work at Marvel Comics on June 24th, 1974. So that was a rather strange thing. And if you want to see what I look like at, well, you can't see what I look like at that very first convention, because back then we did not take photos. But the 1972 program book, I'm the kind of person who always sits in the front row. I always want to know, I got the photo. I always want to know what everyone's saying. I want to see it clearly. I don't want to look over someone's shoulders. So I have a lot of photos of myself and fanzines of the day, because I'm always in the front row. So people take a picture of the panel and they catch me, or they take a photo from the stage and they catch me. This is the 1972 program book for the New York Comic Art Convention. And in it is a photo of, let's make sure I go to the correct side. And this is me over here.
The tall one in the front row.
Wearing a headband, long hair, a denim jacket with a studded peace symbol on the back, and a "War is not healthy for children and other living things" on one shoulder. This is my brother, 4 years younger, who went to that convention.
And you are 16 at this point?
1972, I would have been, well, that photo, I would have been 16, yeah, because that was 1971. And just to point out how much things have changed, I was just tweeting about someone is selling a single page from Action Comics #1. One page is being auctioned off on Heritage. It's been graded and everything. It is slabbed. This one page doesn't have Superman on it. It doesn't have.
Oh, it's not original art. It's just a page of the comic.
A single page from the comic book, and it's being auctioned. I think it's up to nearly $200 now for just the one page from Action Comics #1. When I was there at the auction in 1970 at age 15, they failed to get a $325 opening bid on a copy of Action Comics #1. And I remember sitting there, and at the time I happened to be sitting next to a rather important figure in comics fandom history, Tom Fagan. He's the guy who did the Rutland, Vermont Halloween parades that you may have heard about, that were actually featured in the comics.
I've seen them in comics.
Yeah, they were in Batman, they were in the Avengers. There was actually a crossover because everyone in comics went to them. While I was sitting next to him, someone brought down that Action #1 from the stage and let him flip through it. And I'm going, oh, and that's when I first learned that a lot of Golden Age comics are not full color throughout, that in order to save money on the signatures, some of the panels would just be, some of the signatures would be just red only or green only.
I didn't know.
Without color. Well, Action #1 was. I don't know when they stopped doing that. So I was like, oh, that's fascinating. That's as close as I've ever gotten to an Action #1. And I know 10 years ago, they actually sold one 4-page signature. Take the staples out, and they're all 4 pages. And they sold one 4-page signature for something like $6,500. But it was the signature that had Superman lifting the car. So that's why that one went. I don't think this one with just random cowboys on them is going to sell for that much. But hey, for the brag to say I've got a piece of Action Comics #1, maybe someone's willing to sell $100. I have no idea what it'll go for, but I think the auction ends tomorrow if you go to Heritage. I talked about it on Twitter recently. So anyway. That's then, but where were we in the history?
Back you up a little bit. You went to this convention. Was it 1970, the one that changed your life?
Yes.
Did you meet Duffy Voland there?
No, I did not meet Duffy Voland there. I did not meet Duffy Voland until a couple of years later. I was going to conventions. I made some friends in comics, people who I would meet up intermittently throughout the year between the conventions. And one day I'm at home. I live in Brooklyn. I'm in a place called Georgetown, going to South Shore High School, Ralph and Flatlands Avenue, for anybody who knows Brooklyn. And one day there's a knock at the door, and this guy named Duffy Voland is at the door because he had just moved to Brooklyn from, was it Kansas or Ohio? I can't remember exactly where he came from, though he was a fan writer. He wrote a column called Duffy's Tavern, the title is based on an old-time radio show that is going really way back. It was already old in the 70s to think Duffy's Tavern, because it was an old radio show from the 40s. And that's what he named his regular column, talking about comics. And local kids had seen this guy unloading and moving in, and he had boxes of comics, which is very foolish, of course. You should not move having boxes labeled Fantastic Four comics on it. It might lead someone to try and steal comics even then. Anyway, and they said, there's another guy who's just as weird as you are who reads comics in the neighborhood. And I was known for being the guy who read comics. So one day he knocks at the door, and it's him. And, we became friends. And I never wanted to work in comics, to go back to what we were saying before. My thought of what I was going to be, I went to college and majored in journalism. It's an English major. I eventually thought I would be, there's Duffy up there in the upper.
It's a very small picture of him. I couldn't find a bigger one. And I guess he died very young.
There's a caricature of him on, there's a photo of him in, if I can pull out the correct issue of Foom for you, just so you can see what he looked like. Oh, here we are. Okay, I'm now going to hold something up. This is in Foom number 10 that I showed you before on the editorial page. That is me and Duffy Volan, probably on a panel.
Lower it just a touch. I can only partially. There we go.
That's me and him. And over here, let's make sure we're getting it correctly. I'm going the wrong direction. This is a character by Patty Cockrum as the X-Men in the X-Men issue, and that's me as the Beast, Duffy Volan as the Angel. There's Stan in the wheelchair. I think, let's see, is that Marv Wolfman as Iceman, Len Wein as Cyclops, Patty as Marvel Girl. There was just a character in there that she had done. So he was, a big name fan at the time, and he just knocked at the door. And at the time, I never wanted to work in comics. I just liked being friends. I always had this feeling, it was one of my ethical things back then. People can sense desperation on you. And if someone's hanging out with you only because they want something out of you, oh, this guy is only with me because he hopes I'll get him work, he'll get me a job or whatever. And I was just having a good time, working, a good time hanging around comics, getting autographs, getting sketches from people. I got a whole bookload of sketches I could show you, but that's probably more than we need to get into. But I would, I would carry the second convention I knew, I would show up with a sketch pad because people were not charging for sketches back then. And one day Duffy said, "Hey, I hear Tony Isabella, who edits the Marvel British reprint books, has decided he's leaving. I think he was going to edit the black and white books Marvel did, Monsters Unleashed and the Dracula Lives book and all of the Tales of the Zombie and things like that. And they need someone. Would you want to apply for the job?" And I thought, oh, okay, I guess I can do that. I mean, if they asked me, I wasn't, nosing around trying to do that.
Was Duffy already working there?
Duffy was working there as a freelancer. He was, doing inking and paste ups and all sorts of things like that. And
right. He was an artist, wasn't he? I feel like I saw him do pencils at some point on comics.
He did some inking as well on a variety of things. And he I can't remember what his actual job was in the office. He sort of did everything. He might have worked in the back helping paste up people and correction people as well at the time. And he was just a nice guy. I mean, when Craig Russell first came to New York to start to get a job in comics, he lived with Duffy Volan for a while. So I remember being in Brooklyn and going over and watching Craig Russell in Duffy Volan's basement pencil a lot of those early War of the Worlds strips.
Oh, wow.
That he did, yeah.
In some fancy studio, he was down in a basement.
In a basement in Brooklyn. It had windows in the basement. There were windows there, so it wasn't in total darkness, but still, and I basically had to write some pretend bullpen bulletins pages because the British comic reprints had their own bullpen bulletins pages, and I had to write fake splash pages. And for those who've never seen a British comic book, at least a British comic book at the time, whereas the American comic books at the time would be a single 25-page or 20-page or however many, as we lost pages over the years, and they shrunk from 25 to 24 to 23 to 22. for the British books, you take a 20-page story, let's say, break it into 4 parts, and do a new splash page for parts 2, 3, and 4. So you would take the first 5 pages and just put "to be continued" at the bottom, and it would be in there with the first 5 pages of a Hulk story and the first 5 pages of an Avenger story or whatever. And so they needed someone to write splash pages for those pages 6 through 10. So that's was my job, to say, I'm going to come up with
They hired you on a basis of writing skills, essentially.
a combination of, you're a fan, you know everything. No one is going to slip anything by you as to what issue something happened with. You know the characters intimately. So you can't hire an English major and say, oh, you know how to proofread it, you know English, now edit comic books. So you had to be, and I also had to change baseball references to cricket references in Spider-Man, and change the spelling of color to color, and theater to.
So you were a deep fan who could pass the writing tests, and
Yes, and it could be Stan Lee.
Of changing things too.
If you cut me, I would bleed Stan Lee is basically what it is, that I could write a bullpen bulletins page. And in fact, for 2.5 years, I wrote the bullpen bulletins page. Len Wein did not want to. This is after I moved from the British books to the American bullpen.
So this was a few years later. You wrote
only 5. I spent about 5 months in the Marvel bullpen, and then when there was an opening in the American side of things, I shifted over to that side and worked in the same office with Roger Slifer and Roger Stern and Michelle Wolfman, and my wife Irene Vartanov was there, and the editor-in-chief at the time was Len Wein, would be in that corner office, and of course Stan Lee was just a couple of doors down, and I shifted over. And so
what was your position then?
I assistant editor. I was associate editor of the British books and assistant editor of the American books, and my job was to sit with original comic book artwork and a blue pencil, and as every good comics fan who has every issue memorized, be able to say, that webbing under Spider-Man's arm does not look right. That belt buckle on the Submariner is all wrong. The wings on the Submariner's ankle are a little too high. The eye patch on Nick Fury's face is on the wrong side.
Your nerdiness was paying off big time.
Yes. And what you would do, you would in the margin write, fix webbing, or no, that took place in issue number 27, not in issue number 28, and you send it back to the lettering department, where someone like Mike Esposito, who would be sitting there all day doing these corrections, or Mori Kuramoto, who might fix the lettering, and other folks like that would fix them and return them to you. So you just actually be writing on all the original artwork from 74, 75, 76, and occasionally when I'm at San Diego, I will go look for people selling original art just to peek and see if I could find my handwriting written in the margins down the side where it says, fix this spelling or something like that. So that was my job. I'd sit there all day, and I would read comic books during the day and do some of that freelancing at night. As I said, Len was so busy, he did not want to write the bullpen bulletins. So I wrote everything but Stan's soapbox. Stan would write.
Bullpen bulletins were a freelance thing you did at night when you went home. Not
actually, those I did not. Those were part of my day job. That was not one of the freelance things I got paid extra for. That was part of being an assistant editor.
Did you like run around the office saying, well, do you have something for me to put in both the bulletins this month? Or
you sort of knew everything that was going on, and I can still, if I close my eyes, I can remember going into Len Wein's office and reading my first attempt at being Stan, with all the bombastic blockbusting and all the alliteration and the selling, whatever he was selling, Coles to Newcastle, all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it would just spill out of me, because I knew Stan Lee intimately. When you start reading him at age 6, I started reading him earlier than that, if I was reading Tales of Suspense and things like that. So in 1974, when I was able to read that, pretend to be Stan, it was just easy. I could just slip it on immediately. And that will lead up until several years later, part of my reason for leaving comics, because if you spend all day pretending to be Stan Lee, eventually you are Stan Lee. I think in one of Kurt's One of Kurt Vonnegut's books somewhere says something. I don't know if it's the one about Ice Nine or Cat's Cradle. I don't remember which one. Something like we have to be careful to with who we pretend to be until one day we wake up and discover that's who we are. So that if you spend all day doing that, that's a far leap forward. But if you
So
spend all day
at the time, did you enjoy pretending to be Stan Lee? Were you like, oh my goodness, I get to be Stan Lee?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, the only thing that was difficult was when you're a kid reading comic books, you say, boy, Daredevil did something tremendously stupid this month. And then when you're in comics, you say, boy, that writer had Daredevil do something really stupid this month. So you know what you mean? You end up realizing it's not something that had to happen. It is not something that the character chose to do. It is something that the author of the book chose to have happen.
Right.
And so that does change a relationship when you realize I cannot read a Steve Gerber comic without hearing Steve Gerber reading the captions or whoever it happened to be. So you had that difficulty happen in terms of
now you would see the person that you knew in the script that you were reading.
In the office, you would see them running around the office, yelling at people or getting in an argument or sometimes dealing with people in inappropriate ways, not all the time, but anytime you got miffed at somebody, then that carried over into the work. So the seeing how the sausage is made had a dreadful effect on my ability to appreciate comics. And it took many, many years after I did leave comics before I could read comics again. We could sort of pinpoint the exact time, if I could remember the date. The first comic books that I picked up after having burned out, I went to Clarion in 1979, and I went there in order to cleanse myself and not write any comics anymore. So I don't want to do this anymore.
For those who don't know, we're talking about Clarion Writers Workshop.
A 6-week writers workshop, yeah.
To see writers.
And I said I needed to have some sharp division between before and after. And I sold my entire comic book collection, except for those few that I mentioned. And the first comics I began to pick up were Watchmen #1, Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller, and I remember Don Simpson's Megaton Man #1. If you remember Megaton Man at all, that spoof comic book.
Vaguely, I remember the name Don Simpson.
Yeah, and though he also drew for the DC Wasteland series, but that was after I moved to Massachusetts, where we eventually met. This was probably in that period of 86, 87, 88. So of course that jumps all the way ahead to
right.
The leaving of comics. But when you're in it, you never wanted to go home. Everybody played volleyball together. Everybody was playing poker at everybody else's house. If you wanted to find anyone who worked for comics in the mid-70s, all you had to do, you didn't have to go to the office, figure out which movie theater on Friday night at the first after-dinner showing was showing the blockbuster that had just opened. Because back in those days, you didn't open a movie in 100 theaters. You might have The Shining open in one theater in New York, or maybe a couple, but there'd be the one that would be the theater you wanted to see something in, like the Ziegfeld or the one with the biggest screen. And everybody, just without even planning, would end up going to that show. Because after all, you had to steal big, right? Well, you had to find out what it was like, and you had to make allusions to it in upcoming comics. So Megaton Man was great, says someone down there. But
this gets me to something that I wanted to ask you about, because when you read about the early Silver Age, you'll hear creators say, well, there wasn't really a bullpen. There wasn't a Marvel bullpen you could go visit. It was just a shabby little office. But it sounds like that you and the other fans who became employees at Marvel made that fantasy of Marvel become a reality. Is that an accurate way of looking at it, or?
Well, in a non-575 Madison Avenue way, because the office still had a smaller footprint to it. Meaning the artist would still come in. Rich Buckler would show up at the office. Billy Graham would show, up at the office. The individual artists. I remember Frank Robbins, before I believe he ended up moving to Mexico, would show up at the office. Bob Brown, who was drawing Daredevil. So everyone was passing through the office. In the office, obviously, you had big names. I mean, Marie Severin was there every day. Johnny Romita was there every day. Stan Lee, I was lucky enough to be there before he went Hollywood to try and create the cinematic universe. He was there every day. He only started going to California at the tail end, so I'd see him every week and have meetings. We'd be pulled into his office every week. Mike Esposito, I would see every day. And the one thing I regret, and I think about this a lot now that I am an older and wiser person, how could I afford to play poker? We'd just be throwing in nickels and dimes. That's what we would do back then, Paolo. They would not be big pots. If you were lost $15 in an evening after playing for 3 or 4 hours on a really bad night, that would be as far as you would lose. So this was not big money we were playing with back then in 1974. But the thing I regret now is how little interest I had in the people who were older and were no longer involved in dealing with comics. I mean, if you think about who I was seeing every single day, right? Sal Brodsky, who was the managing editor, who was not doing anything creative then. He was making the trains run on time. He inked early issues of the Fantastic Four. He designed the Fantastic Four logo. He was doing stuff all the time. George Roussos, who ran the coloring department, was working. I believe he may have even worked on Detective 27. I mean, he was involved in the business as an artist going way back to the Golden Age. And he was just a guy who, did coloring, and he went for coloring corrections. Mike Esposito, who was with Ross Andrew, who I'd see all the time. They knew each other when they were in high school. They drew Wonder Woman together for 11 years. They drew Edelman, John Verporten, who was a production manager, Jumbo John Verporten, who scared us all to death, who again was not doing anything of a creative nature. He inked early issues of the Fantastic Four. He was there at the beginning. And at no point did I sit down and say to these people, oh my God, what was it like to have been there? You worked in the golden age of comics? Tell me what it was like back then. And we were the third generation of comics professionals, or maybe the fourth generation of comics professionals, were so self-absorbed that we did not care about those older folks. So I'm terribly, and I've spoken to other people, people who worked with Wally Wood, for example, who were some of his assistants. I think, and I did Eating the Fantastic, I interviewed Paul Kirshner, who was Wally Wood's assistant for a while, and I think he got a little bit out of it about the old days. But we were not asking questions, because once they were no longer the artist anymore, somehow they were invisible. So we were terrible, not realizing how one, they were human beings. So we knew they were fun to be with, but we never paid attention to them when we had that fount of wisdom there. And so RTB's asking how many people were in the Marvel office. I would say it was probably 45 or 50. If you look at the cover of Foom, which I did not edit, Marie Severin did a wonderful cover of Foom where she drew a map of the entire office, and you could see everyone sitting there. And it was a cover of Foom a couple of episodes, a couple of issues after, and she did a guide to where everyone was. Of course, a lot of the people were visiting were freelancers as opposed to the staff people, but you could see, if you find that cover, exactly how many desks there were. She did a caricature of every single person who worked at Marvel at the time, and I'm in it. And my wife at the time, Irene Vartanov, is in there as well. But that will show you what the Marvel office really looked like at the time I was there. But that's really my one regret, the not interrogating people, whether they would have wanted to listen to the fanboy stuff or be bored by it. Oh, come on, kids. Like people like Marie Severin were stunned anybody gave a damn. She's wonderful.
You remained friends with Marie, right?
For years, yeah. We were visiting them all through her later years. We would visit her, at least once a year. We'd go up to New York, and sometimes several times a year. Took her out for her 80th birthday to dinner, and
I hear her mentioned when people talk about women in comics and how maybe women weren't given the opportunities that men were. And she was a great artist, and she'd been around since the EC days, at least as a colorist. Did you have a sense of her feeling that there were many opportunities not given to her?
Well, I didn't have a sense of her, but there was definitely a sense that if you were a woman, most women were colorists. I mean, basically, if you look
I
at
remember Irene saying the men got asked to be writers and the women got asked to be colorists.
yeah, so Glynis Wein and Michelle Wolfman and Irene and a whole bunch of people. I mean, basically, that would end up happening, and they were unfairly looked down upon even for that, to the extent that you only got to be a colorist because you're related to someone. So even when they got the thing that they weren't getting the other thing, they were still had that issue of having been a woman. But I loved knowing Marie Severin. The thought that I went from being a kid as a fan, and I remember. Let's see if I've got one of those here. I'll flip through while I keep talking. I was basically a fan and knew her at comic book conventions. So here, for example, is a sketch. I will remove it from the folder because it's much too shiny here, and you wouldn't want to see it. Or maybe it'll fall apart. Here's a sketch I got of her of Kull the Conqueror back when I would have been 16 years old.
Oh, let me get you full screen. That's beautiful.
And this was just me as a kid with a sketchbook, and I'd go around and I'd ask people for sketches, because back in the day, I was there before people started charging for sketches, and I remember I was even at the convention when everything changed. When Neil Adams suddenly said, I should be charging for these sketches, and he would charge people $10 a sketch. And he would do them 10 minutes a piece, and an hour later we had enough money for a steak dinner. And people would sit around him on the floor at the Statler Hilton Hotel when I was 17 years old or whatever, 16, 17 years old. But in the old days, there was none of that. People would just, I'll hold up, you got some glare here. I won't take them up, but that's Rich Buckler, 1972, The Scarlet Witch. So this is back in the old days. You could get too far afield with these before we haven't even gotten into getting into comics and getting burned out from comics. I'll just show you the two sketches that are the most important sketches, that I feel the most important sketches. At the 1972 EC Comic Book Convention,
I didn't know that convention
I met Jack Davis, the great Jack Davis, and I said, could you do my caricature? And this is what I looked like back in 1972. Yeah, I had hair like that. And so that is that's one of them. And the second one, that is my most important one, I'll have to pull up a different folder for that, is when I met Jerry Robinson. Jerry Robinson, who is so responsible for early Batman. Him and Bill Finger are more so than Bob Kane are responsible. And I'm going to get to my most important ones. Jerry Robinson, who I think died at 91. He did this one of Batman, but
when was that?
This would have probably been in 1972. I was 16 or 17 years old.
So guys like Jerry Robinson were just there handing out free sketches to anyone.
If you asked, if you had chutzpah, if you were an annoying kid with a sketchbook. And the even more important one, and this one I should really have framed on the wall. This was before I was involved in comics. Now I'm just showing off. Someone said, Jerry Robinson, who created Robin, or considered Coke.
Oh, that's a beauty.
Hi, Scott. Hope you join us in the comics. He probably drew this in 1972 for me, again, when I was 17. And that's probably the one I value the most, because that's a connection to comic books past, comic book history that, history. And I realized when I saw Jerry Robinson once at a San Diego Comic Convention, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. He was already in his late 80s. And I said, hi, Jerry, you drew a sketch of me when I was 17 years old, or you drew a sketch when I was 17 years old. A man does not want to look up at a guy who at the time was in his mid-50s and be told they drew a sketch of you when you were 17 years old. It was, I realized, yeah, I might be making him feel a little bit old, but I did want to thank him for that. So it was good to bump into him, at that time. So those are, and I just went off on a tangent from some other story, and I don't remember what story we were heading to tell.
We were talking about the women in comics. We were talking about that you work side by side with all these older generation, but didn't know much what they were up to.
Well, we might have lost the drift of where we were heading with that, but yeah, I was working in comics. I was freelancing as much as possible.
Stan Lee, maybe that was the last part of the.
I was, I was loving it at the time, but eventually, things began to sour for a variety of reasons. One was realizing I'm getting absolutely no writing done of my own. Before getting the job, I was trying to write short stories all the time, working on my fiction. I was writing no fiction, and I was realizing my fiction was starting to sound like Stan Lee. If you were used to using alliteration all the time and sentence structure in a certain way, you find that you no longer have control. There are things you pick up. I make it be akin to an artist who's working in advertising and using primary bold colors all the time, and then goes home and wants to do a pastel and can't because they're developing ruts in the way they do shortcuts of their mind. And you got to recognize, these covers that you're popping up there, I was writing these at age 19, 20, 21, 22. So I don't have the maturity that I have now that I can build a wall between things and have a day job in which I do one thing and then work on my own stuff on the side. It was impossible to keep that wall up. So that was one aspect of it. I just couldn't do it at that age, and I had to make a break. And not all of it is within my control. As I talked about in my podcast recently, I did an episode where I was talking about getting out of comics, and someone was asking. I wrote Captain Marvel for 7 issues, and the reason I only wrote 7 issues of Captain Marvel is because of my immaturity at the time. Archie Goodwin pulled me into his office after not having had editorial feedback from him at all. I got all my editorial feedback from the Jim Shooter, who was the assistant editor or associate editor or whatever he was calling himself at the time. And I was not hearing that anyone had any issues with any of my writing at all. And, Jim would say, I occasionally have to fix a sentence or two or change a caption or whatever, which is the job of the editor. And Archie basically told me after that latest issue that, well, if you don't shape up, we're not going to, let you write the book anymore. You got to get better as a writer. And I just got all flushed and heated and blew up and felt as if I'd been slapped in the face and blew up at him. And no, I never worked with Frank Thorne, Werewolf. And I just behaved in a very immature way. If someone else these days, if I'm told I'm not doing something right, I have a way of letting them know, well, what am I doing wrong? I'll get better at it. And I basically talked myself out of writing Captain Marvel. And I still wrote various fill-in issues and backups and did a lot more work for DC. But I, at age 21, did not have the maturity to know what to do in that situation. So, there's writing skill and there were other things involved as well. So there was that part of it as well. So that's why I ended up leaving Captain Marvel in the middle of a cliffhanger. Because by age 21, I didn't know how to handle myself with that. But I ended up doing a lot more. I went for DC and wrote Supergirl. And
do know how to handle themselves.
What's that?
Very few people at age 21 do know how to handle that sort of thing.
That's the whole thing. When you think about it, it's wild that why am I doing anything there at that age? Why was I in charge of running the 1975 Marvel convention at age 20? I was designing the programming book and everything. Who would give that to someone? Who gives that first issue of Foom I edited? I was only 19 and a half years old. Today, if Marvel were going to run a convention, it'd be a year of meetings with high-level executives arguing over it and planning it out. And the program we'd done months in advance. But back in 1974, they say, "Oh, Scott, what should the program be?" And I would come up with a program and give it to Stan and Sol, and I get memos back saying, "No, change this and do a different thing." For example, and Stan would give me feedback. Stan would say, "Oh, that panel you're showing some scarecrow I wrote back then." Stan said, "Don't use the word horror in the title of the panel about horror comics because parents hate the word horror. Use suspense, use mystery." Because Stan lived through a time when horror killed comics, when horror almost destroyed Marvel, almost destroyed the entire industry back with Frederick Wertham and the beginnings of the Comics Code. So I didn't have that appreciation back then that when he's giving me that feedback, don't use the word horror. That's the scars showing of having watched the business, the industry almost be totally destroyed.
Yeah.
So, but who gives a kid that? That's why, I mean, writing is one thing, but that level of administrative stuff, it's because I think, did Stan start working at comics at age 15? And is there the theory that kids know what kids like?
Right.
I have a question up there I'll answer. Who is my favorite artist I work with? The thing about working with artists is there was no artist who was my peer who I loved working with as much as I loved working with the people I adored as a kid, because there's that special magic of feeling as if I am inside the comics I read as a kid, to say, well, wait a second, George Tuska, who was the Iron Man artist when I was a kid, drew an issue of Captain Marvel. Jim Mooney, who was the Supergirl artist when I was a kid, who did Tommy Tomorrow, drew my issue of Omega the Unknown, that he got to do that. Ramona Fradon, it's not a Marvel thing, but Ramona Fradon, who drew Metamorpho when I was a kid, drew one of my stories for House of Mystery. So working with all of those people was just the most magical thing. More so, even though other people might have been better artists or better suited to a project, or more able to make the plot flow, there was something magical about dealing with people who I read before I was a professional at comics. There's just absolutely no way that that can be beaten.
Well, yeah, I mean, my impression of comics now is by the time the writers get into the big Marvel and DC comics, they're usually in their 30s or something. They've kind of clawed their way up for years.
It could be. And the thing you have to realize about the industry at the time is I benefited from the fact that there was an explosion that the current talent load of the company was able to deal with. I mean, imagine a company that suddenly says, we're not going to start publishing 3 or 4 times as many titles as we did last year. Can't do it with the people we have. We must bring people in. Every book was late. Every book had a fill-in. Everyone was falling farther behind. So many of the comics I wrote were written to try and have the regular artists catch up. That Master Kung Fu that I did, that Omega the Unknown that I did, and a variety of other things were because, okay, they're behind. What we're going to do is we're going to get writers like Bill Mantlo, who benefited from this more than anyone else. We're going to have a fill-in issue of every comic book that we publish just sitting there out of canon, not out of canon, but out of timeline, and just sitting there to threaten the writers and artists with. And if you get too late, we're just going to throw this in an issue, and then you'll be able to catch up. And the feeling was, we'll have all. Then they won't do it because they won't want to miss the work. They won't want to have someone break with their mess with their timeline, and they would be used the moment they were finished because they would just fall behind. All the 5- and 6-page backup features I did, like the one which was the very first job John Romita Jr. ever did, which is a Spider-Man backup, were because they said, maybe people will catch up if we have folks write 14 and 15-page stories and we get someone else to do 5- and 6-page stories. And yes, in the back of the Spider-Man annual, all the way in the back is John Romita Jr.'s first story where they go back to the coffee bean. And these were meant so that the main artists could catch up, which they never did. But But without that explosion, there would not have been a need for us youngsters whose talent levels were probably not fully professional to do these things. So I am just thrilled that I got to write like this particular story you're showing, John Romita Jr.'s first ever published work. And I am so thrilled that John Romita Jr. remembers it, because you do things in your life and you figure, oh, no one's going to ever remember anything. When John Romita Jr. moved from Marvel to DC and started drawing Superman, he talked about his first work, which was this. Oh, I understand your first job was doing this backup feature. And he thanked me by name in the New York Times article interview, because he was not getting work because people said, oh, if we give John Romita Jr. work, that's nepotism, because his father, John Romita Sr., is the art director and the great Spider-Man artist. And people shouldn't get work just because of who they're related to. And he actually, in the interview, said, but Scott Edelman said there's only one thing worse than nepotism, and that's anti-nepotism, not giving work to someone who deserves it just because they're related. And the fact that 40 years later, he remembered me saying that back in 1975 or whatever, and making sure that he got this opportunity. I thought it made poetic sense to have his first job be a Spider-Man story.
And you were right, because he was a talent on his own and proved it throughout the decades.
Yeah, but this story wouldn't have even existed. All of these backups would not have existed had they not needed more pages, had the maw of publishing not been so desperate to hit deadlines. I mentioned John Reporton earlier. One of my most vibrant memories is sitting in the bullpen proofreading the original artwork for an issue of a comic. I can't remember exactly which one it was. And John walked in, Jumbo John Reporton. He was huge. I'm 6'4", he's taller, and he was very large. And he just took the original art from me. And I said, John, I haven't finished reading that one yet. And he said, you'll read it when it comes out. Because we got charged something like $50 or $100 a day for every day we were late, because the presses ran 24 hours a day. And it would be, okay, this issue of Spider-Man will print from 5 o'clock to 5:30 on this date. And if you miss it, you still pay for the time. They just, throw one comic after another. The presses are so huge, they never start them up. They're just rolling continuously. And by the time I was in public, I was working at Science Fiction Age. I think if we missed a deadline, it was something like $500 or $1,000 a day. Wow. If we're missing a deadline. And that's why it was so important. And that's why that dreaded deadline doom was so much of a doom. And there was all that struggle, and why so many new comics meant new work for new people. And that's probably, our generation got the benefit of that. And some people hung around and stayed around, and others like me, took off and focused more on their own writing, or ended up getting into editing. Or, I edited Science Fiction Age magazine, as we discussed when you were in my basement, discussing the launch of that back in 1991. But that was, sort of the end of my comics, when I realized, no, I don't want to be in this anymore. I no longer like reading comics anymore. From hanging around the people involved in comics. I was also part of the Jim Shooter era, about which you may recall Roy Thomas said something like, when the sharks show up, it's time for the dolphins to leave. That was something that Roy Thomas said about when he left Marvel for DC.
The same way about Jim Shooter?
I eventually came to at the time, because I sort of felt, I told that story about the buffer I had between Archie Goodwin and what Jim was telling me, and I sort of felt I was getting a miscommunication as to what was actually perceived about my writing on Captain Marvel at the time. But that's, hey, Jim Shooter and I went skydiving together back in the old days. No, I don't think there are skydiving photos in one of the issues of Foom.
I can't resist. I read part of Irene's novel in which a character who resembles Jim Shooter is the romantic lead.
Well, the thing about romances is often the heroes are very machismo, harsher.
He's a very difficult character.
I'm looking in here to see which issue. I can't remember which issue of Foom had the photos of me skydiving with Jim Shooter. Back before it all fell apart, when I was still
Do you think Jim was malicious there, or do you think he was also too inexperienced as an editor at the time to?
Well, he was a far better businessman than any of the people who came before him.
Right.
In that no one else who was really editor-in-chief really knew how to deal with other businessmen. Nobody ever knew how to put on a suit and go up and talk to the higher-ups and be taken seriously. At the time, people like Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, who were brilliant, creative people, I don't think necessarily wanted that business side of things. And Jim Shooter did help make the trains run on time. He did things that were, from a commercial standpoint, made a lot of sense. From a making friends within the industry standpoint, they didn't make sense. But he did not want to necessarily, once he had the role, be the old pal anymore. So he probably did a good job from the standpoint of a commercial enterprise, but not necessarily from being liked. And he did things that were tremendously profitable. Secret Wars, I guess, was one of the most profitable things the company ever did up until then. Wasn't that him? If I'm remembering,
that was him. Yeah.
If I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, and he had his issues as well. But he got into comics at age 14, if you remember.
Right.
He was a kid, the child of a Pittsburgh steelworker, got into doing Legion of Superheroes. Werewolf by Lunchtime asked if I ever had an interview with Back Issue magazine. Not a career-spanning one, but they've done individual articles on the Marvel convention or on FOOM or on the British books or on things like that. So there are little pieces of things that
I've seen both you and Irene quoted frequently in Back Issue magazine.
Yeah, because people call up, because my career, that's the thing about my comics career, it was not deep. It was broad but shallow. I've had my fingers in many different pies. The one Spider-Man story, the one X-Men story, the one Falcon story, the one Master of Kung Fu story. So every single page I've ever written for Marvel has been reprinted. Very little I've ever written for DC has ever been reprinted. In fact, the House of Secrets story that just got reprinted was the first thing ever. No one wants to reprint my Welcome Back, Kotter comics for some reason. I can't quite figure that out. And one of my stories has been reprinted.
Tell us about doing Welcome Back, Kotter, because I don't know anything about that.
Okay, well, before I go to that, one last thing. I was lucky enough to have known in 1975 that 45 years later, Thanos was going to be an important character, because I wrote the only standalone Thanos story, a 5-page backup where he fought Drax the Destroyer. It has probably been reprinted 15 times, 20 times. It was part of the Free Comics Day giveaway maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I get paid each time. And, because that's why I said I've touched so many different characters that I keep getting reprinted. But I never had a long, it's not like Peter David, no 10-year run on the Hulk and things like that. In terms of Welcome Back, Kotter, I think I got that job over at DC because as far as the editors at DC were concerned, I was a sweat hog. I was a kid. I was in my early 20s. My voice still had a thick, heavy Brooklyn accent. I lived in Brooklyn, New York, and they must have assumed, oh, he knows those people. And I did, just the same way I knew Stan Lee so that I could write bullpen bulletins pages effortlessly. Once I ingested the information, it would come out sounding like Stan Lee. I wrote a couple issues of Welcome Back, Kotter, and I could speak. I knew those sweat hogs. I knew them all. I went to school with them. I was a sweat hog going to South Shore High School in Brooklyn, New York. So I had a lot of fun. It was probably one of the most fun things I ever did. In fact, when someone said, what thing of yours should we read to get through the pandemic? I said, well, nothing. The only thing I can think of that is going to make you laugh and distract you for a while are the Welcome Back, Kotter comic books. Because I love that TV show. And it was,
it was just probably never be reprinted because of copyright issues of different things.
True, and I thought my Master of Kung Fu, that was the last thing that had never been reprinted at Marvel until they finally worked out the Sax Romer estate and were able to reprint all that in those mammoth editions. So I got a copy.
I just read your Master of Kung Fu story like 2 days ago, and I was actually amazed, especially knowing how young you were, what a good job you did of creating a fill-in issue that fit perfectly with the Master of Kung Fu mythos and everything. if I didn't know better, I would have thought it was just written by the regular team. And so
Oh,
you
well,
have
thank you.
talent there for making things fit, I think.
Well, that's part of having read every single Marvel comic. The Rick Jones story I did, I can't remember what backup it was in at the moment. The Coming of Captain Avenger. I think I have a little thing at the note. This takes place in between Avengers number 5 and 6, or something like that, or between Avengers number 6 and 8, because you would have to say, oh, when could these things take place? And I can't really remember what my footnote was on the Coming of Captain Avenger, but I would do that with these stories. Try and figure out, is there a footnote down at the bottom? I can't see on the screen.
No. Oh, but
I think there is
between Avengers 14 and 15.
Yeah, they just think about someone who knows early Avengers so much that you would decide that this story I'm about to tell took place between those two very specific issues.
Yeah.
So that's what knowing comics intimately back then meant. And someone, by the way, I'll just answer, did I ever work with Bernie Wrightson? Not professionally, though I did play volleyball with him. I was over at his house many times. Everybody would go to Queens and play volleyball and softball together. And so I knew him. And all those people, Bernie Wrightson, Mike Kaluta, everybody was hanging around. I was on the softball team. I was voted most improved player because I was so terrible. Marie Severin did little certificates for everybody, and that's what mine was. But no, unfortunately, I never had a chance to work with him.
So you were talking about how you were most thrilled when you would get to work with an artist from your childhood. Were there artists at the time that you were big fans of, or was it all too new, and they were all just people you hung out with? Or like,
I certainly loved, mentioning the name Bernie Wrightson. I adored Bernie Wrightson's work. I adored Mike Kaluta's work. These were not people, though, who really did much work for Marvel at the time. They were doing a lot of covers for DC. If I could, one of the writers or artists, if I could choose to draw like anyone, it would be Mike Kaluta's work. I loved Craig Russell. Craig Russell was one of the greatest Marvel artist. I don't know if you could even consider him a Marvel artist, a fine artist. If you've seen all the work that he did with Don McGregor on War of the Worlds and all the work he's doing now he did the Ring Cycle, he's doing a lot of opera books, he's doing a lot of Oscar Wilde fairy tales, he's sort of gotten doing the things he loves more than working in mainstream comics. He's built himself a wonderful career. So there's some people pencil work I absolutely loved, and those were some of them. Craig, I would have loved to have done something, with Craig. Let's see, who would I have loved to work with at the time, but never. If given the chance, this did not happen. But when I wrote that first Scarecrow story, that was drawn by Rico Raval, if you have the interior of that Dead of Night number 11, and by the way, I do have a couple of pages from that comic book, but the covers. But actually, so wait, back up to that cover. I was just asked that I work with Bernie Wrightson. How could I say I never worked with Bernie Wrightson? That cover is inked by Bernie Wrightson.
Yeah, nowadays we don't think of how Bernie Wrightson might have inked other people.
That's Bernie Wrightson over Gil Kane.
That's a cool team up of artists.
Yeah, a cover which Gil Kane got that and sold it to me for $10.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Nice.
So
do you still have it?
Yes, I do.
That
it is under museum quality glass, so it would not fade.
At a guess, I would assume that's worth $20,000 or more now.
It could be. I don't think I'll ever sell it. People keep coming and asking me to sell artwork to someone who owns all of that Thanos story except for the one page I own, and keeps coming up to me wanting to buy it. And I say, you can have it when it's owning it or eating dog food, which hopefully will never happen because I have not sold.
Your son want to keep it.
Well, there's that nostalgia thing of having it. But to get back to this, was drawn by Rico Raval, one of the Filipino artists who never met Rico Raval because they would ship scripts to the Philippines and the artwork would come back. So this is not done Marvel style. This is done, anything that went to the Philippines was done DC style. But the artist, one who I adored back then, was Alex Nino.
Oh yeah.
And I would have loved to have this drawn by. I have that page, by the way, as well. And I would have loved to have worked with Alex Nino. Not that he was probably older than me as well, but he was someone who was at least a contemporary within the comics field, and he would have been my first choice for having drawn that
That-
issue.
So did you prefer writing DC style, the full script, since you're not a person who enjoys collaborating from what, at least now? Maybe back then you were different.
I was fine with both of them at the time. The thing about doing the Marvel style wasn't, again, so much doing the Marvel style as being Stan Lee.
It was the voice. It was not having your own voice.
It was, this is how you do it. You tell a story. Not that I ever jumped on a desk the way Stan Lee would, for the comics that were done at the time, but that's how Marvel did it. That's what made Marvel so much better than DC to my eyes as a kid. That collaborative aspect, that the artist had so much of an input as to the flow of the story, rather than, we've all seen comic book script panels where they've put 20 panels on a page and all the words block out the art. Well, that can happen Marvel style also, where the writer is trying to compensate and get his word in. But I can remember sitting there with pages of original artwork and putting a piece of vellum over the page and placing where the panels were, and then writing the accompanying script and numbering them. And it was a fun jigsaw puzzly thing to that. And the artist would do a certain amount of the work because you weren't having to describe what was in the room, the way that you did later. So I like both of them. I have no idea if I would ever work in comics again. Probably not, because of my inability to yield an inch. And also these days, I have no idea what a story's about until I write the second draft. Until I'm done with it, I'm not even sure, do I have a story? So to deal with someone, I guess you would just write that plot over and over again before giving it to the artist. But the artist would want input too. The artist these days wants to say, hey, what if we do this and what if we do that? And I guess I'm just terrible at that, and unwilling to be that person.
Well, it makes it perfect for you to be a prose writer, where you are.
Right, it's no longer a democracy. I am, in charge of the stories that I want to tell. So
this may go back to your, or cover your future career, the rest of your career. Why zombies?
Oh, I love zombies. To me, is the perfect metaphor for the human condition. We're all eventually going to be zombies if we live long enough and don't die of heart attacks. We'll forget who we are and be wandering through the world, not really seeing the world and not remembering who we were. And it ends up being the perfect metaphor for so many of the stories that I've told over the years. In fact, I've written one story, the lead story in my collection, What Will Come After, when they wanted an original story for the book. And I said, oh boy, I've written so many metaphorical stories about zombies. I made me the lead. It's basically an autobiographical zombie told in future tense, what happens after I die and come back as a zombie. And I stumble around the house looking at frame photos on the wall. Not looking, bumping into frame photos on the wall I don't recognize, and knocking over books I once wrote that I don't know. And, moving through the world. And my wife is in that, and my parents are mentioned, and my son is mentioned, and where I live and where I've lived. And it's a very personal story, and it ends up choking me up when I read it in these days, because at the time I wrote the story, everyone I mentioned was still alive, but my parents have both passed since then, as has my mother-in-law. So now when I read the story, and there's a very contorted tense-wise sentence, because it's in the future, and you when you say something like, I will have been happy that my parents will have died prior to this having taken place, so they won't have had to experience the zombie uprising. But when I wrote that sentence, they were alive. And then read that story and mention your father and your mother when they're no longer here has a different. It gets me in a different way. So when I read it, it was a little more powerful. But I write about many things. But I think of the 100 short stories that I've published, could be that 15 of them have been about zombies, maybe even 20. I'm not sure. I'd have to do a full counted that. But I write all sorts of other things around. Obviously the analog stories were not zombie stories.
Did you write any zombie stories when you were doing all those mystery horror stories for DC?
I did not, but while I answer this next question, perhaps you can use your magic fingers to Google Don Perlin Scarecrow and show this person what never got published. Someone asked me, did I meet Don Perlin? And he had an unorthodox style. He did have an interesting style which worked on Werewolf by Night. He was not a flashy artist. He was a great storyteller. I did meet him. There's in fact a photograph of me at the Marvel comic book convention. And he also drew what would have been the splash page for an issue of the Scarecrow that never happened, because the Scarecrow, he would have been the artist on the Scarecrow. I don't know if you can find it if you do Don Perlin the Scarecrow. That was supposed to have been the splash page for, I think, Scarecrow #2. Oh, I don't know what happened to the original. I have a photocopy of it. And that was the story that appeared in Marvel Spotlight was going to be, I believe, Scarecrow #1. And we were going to take this, I believe, and put it over that story and then have the rest of it. Or maybe I'm remembering it correctly at the moment. Probably this was going to be #2, and he was going to then do the whole rest of the issue. And this was a sort of a Will Eisner-ish kind of title.
It's a really nice page.
Usage, and it's a wonderful page. And it was canceled. There was the explosion I was telling you about. The implosion happened immediately after. They're like, over the weekend, they canceled a dozen books. There's actually a subscription ad out there that has Scarecrow #1 on it.
Oh.
And if you do Scott Edelman, Don Perlin, you could actually show a photo of us together in 1975. If you can, I don't know if you can find that. If you on my blog just search for Don Perlin, you should be able to find the photo of him. There we are. That's me and Don Perlin at the 1975 Marvel comic book convention. If you click on it, yeah, there we are. That's what I look like back then. That's what I look like back then. I don't know if I
beard. They're trendy now.
I don't know if I have that photo at hand. I might not, of me and.
Well, that's kind of a painful what might have been you and Don Perlin maybe having a ongoing Scarecrow series. That would have been cool.
I know, and who knows what that would have, what that would have been like back then. And I am not sure whether I am able to share another photo. We shall see. You have been doing all sorts of things like showing your background, but if people really want to know what I look like for most of my Marvel career, and maybe I can't do it. It's a photo of me and Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, and
is it on your website? I guess I could search for it.
Perhaps you could, but I don't know where I could find it. Anyway, I was at Cosmic Con with them in Toronto in 1975. And that is basically what I looked like back then. Now, if you, it might be under Marv Wolfman or something. Who knows? Anyway, I don't know if I shared it. Anyway, forget it. That's probably more than people need to see. But there is a photo of me with them as well. But that's generally what I looked like back in 1975. At Marvel Con membership badge is up there on my hat. And that was me as I wandered around. I ended up after that I ended up getting cleaned up a little bit. Here's my Marvel Comics company ID. You can pull back to have me show up. Let's see here. There were no IDs the first year, but they're not.
So the real name of the company was Cadence?
Cadence was the corporation, but it says Marvel on the card over there. Well, they owned a vitamin company. They owned, I think, a pen and pencil company. They owned a whole bunch of things. But that's a card I got in 1975. I had to carry that card because the first time I bumped into Howard Chaykin, it's very funny. he said to me, "What happened to your hair?" Because most times when you say that to someone, it's because they've lost their hair or they've gone all white or something. But it's because I look like Rasputin back then. I look like, if you look at Crazy magazine, it's a photo I shared. If you Google on your site there, Crazy, and there's a photo of me. Well, I think I use it on Twitter, maybe, and not on Twitter. I use it on Facebook as my ID. But there's a photo of me sticking my tongue out with my fingers in my ears for Crazy magazine. And that's what I looked like back then. So when he said, "What happened to your hair?" he means, how come you look like a normal human being rather than Rasputin? Yeah, that's what I looked like back then. And this photo was taken for Crazy magazine in a spoof ad that Steve Gerber wrote. They needed someone to pretend to be a kung fu master for an ad on the inside front cover of Crazy, and they took this photo in the Marvel office. So that was me back then. I started carrying my Marvel ID to conventions because people remembered me that way, and they would see me as I am now, and so I would carry this card to hold up from 1975, even though I was neatened up a bit in the card, and say, "No, that's not. This is me. This is what I used to look like, and I look like this now." And that was me back then. And so anyway, I've been feeling very nostalgic for a combination of where we are. As I said, a couple days from now, 50 years ago, was my first convention that led me to here and had me experiencing all these things. And a couple of days ago, 46 years ago, is my first day at Marvel Comics. And people are getting of an age that they are passing. So we have a reason to be thinking of people like Denny O'Neil, who passed recently, and Joe Sinnott, who we started our conversation talking about, and any number of people who you lose. Len Wein, who hit me when he passed, who really changed my life by giving me so many chances, moving me to the American Bullpen, letting me write the Bullpen Bulletins pages, letting me start on the Scarecrow, and so much else that happened. So we are beginning to lose them one by one, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do with my own podcast, Eating the Fantastic, is interview people. It's not primarily a comic book podcast. I do science fiction people because comic book people are hard to get. For people who've never been to a convention and don't know what conventions are like, if you go to a science fiction convention, people are just floating around all over the place. They'll do their panel. Maybe they'll go to a friend's panel. They'll spend most of the time in the bar. There's no problem in saying, "Let's go out to dinner, let's go out to lunch for 2 or 3 hours and have a conversation that I record and you guys get to eavesdrop on." You go to a comic book convention and Marv Wolfman or whoever it is, they're trapped. People show up, they sit in the dealer's room, they make their living signing comic books, selling copies of scripts and posters they've signed. If they're artists, they're taking assignments. To go to someone and say, "Yeah, I want you to go for a 3-hour lunch in the middle of your most profitable day of the year," you can't do. So most of the comic book people I've gotten have been outside of conventions, and that's why there are so few of them. I hope to eventually get everyone who's still alive who I ever knew. But when I did Don McGregor, it was on a break from ReaderCon, a con that he wasn't going to. On the way home from the airport, we talked for a couple hours. Larry Lieber, co-creator of Ant-Man, Iron Man, and Thor, I was on a trip to New York and just took him out to his favorite French restaurant. Paul Levitz, I was on a trip to New York and we went and had steak somewhere. So I had to get most of these people outside of the context of a convention. Jerry Conway, during the Nebula Awards a year or two ago, and Mark Evanier, I had lunches to talk about the old comics. And it's wonderful getting them down, getting their memories down. But
and your interviews are so different from your average interview that I recommend all comic book fans pour through your podcast and find the comic book ones.
Yeah, track down like Paul Levitz, for example. I knew Paul Levitz when I was 16 and he was 15. So if someone from the Wall Street Journal who read 2 comics and wants to discuss comics calls them, they're not going to get him to be self-revelatory or relaxed the way I would. I was at his house when I was a kid. I met his mother. So not that we're spending all the time talking about those things, but there's a certain level of knowing that you will be handled well and knowing that the questions will be asked won't be these stupid, obvious first questions always asked by people who know nothing about comics. So, Jerry Conway and Maura Wolfman and all those folks, I was going to attempt to, if not for COVID-19, I reached out to Roy Thomas to sit with him at Awesome Con, which would have happened in DC the first weekend in May. I had also reached out to Ron Mars, a newer comic book person. He's not new, but he's newer than me.
New to you.
And we would have talked, and those were not definites, but we were, trying to work with schedules to see if it was even possible to have them take place when they were in the DC area. And I hope there'll be many more. I was going to make a day trip a couple of weeks ago to New York and get Danny Fingeroth and talk to him. And I was also going to try and get either Joe Duffy or Larry Hama, people like that. But this COVID is messing with us all. And my first new episodes I'm going to try and do will probably involve picnicking with people in a park with an entire blanket between us, and recording while we're 8 feet apart, because there are still some local people who I might get. But anyway, I hope to have those voices. Steve Stiles, by the way, Steve Stiles, a great artist who passed last year. He worked in the Marvel bullpen and worked in the Marvel British books immediately after I did. So we didn't work together then at the same time. And he has since passed, and I'm so glad that I got his voice, that people get to hear what a great person he was and about his career for a couple of hours. I also did Paul Kirshner, he was Wally Wood's assistant and worked with Ralph Reese.
Yeah, I really like.
So he's another one. And to talk, you're not going to have many podcasts where two people both try to imitate Flo Steinberg's voice. But
your interview with George R.R. Martin was more of a comic fan interview than a science fiction writer interview. So
my George R.R. Martin was funny. I told him we would not discuss. He said, "Oh, I can't talk about Game of Thrones." I said, "We're not going to talk about Game of Thrones. He's got nothing to say about Game of Thrones. He said everything he could say, and it would just be regurgitation. And the stuff you won't hear, he can't talk to you about, right?" So we just talked about his love of comics and his early fanish days. And I told him that I would not. I was actually upset. He actually mentioned the words Game of Thrones once. I was not going to mention Game of Thrones at all. I introduced him as, you might know him from his award-winning horror stories. You might know him from his fanzine writing. Oh, and you might know him from the TV shows he was involved with, like Max Headroom. And there was another one. Yes, Beauty and the Beast. Never mentioned Game of Thrones, but near the end he mentioned it. And I was hoping not to mention it at all. But at the very end, I inserted an interview I did with him for Science Fiction Age magazine, which was when he had a show about people slipping through. It was like Sliders, and I'm blanking out on the name of the show that never came to air. Doorways, I think it was called Doorways, perhaps. And, Doorways, he mentioned something like, well, I said, what are you working on? Is it easier? You write both for movies and television and prose. Which is easier to do? And how do you decide when you get an idea which it is? And he says, well, I'm working on this idea. It's a big sprawling idea in many locations and hundreds of characters. And, and the thing of it is, this one has to be in novel form, because there's no way you could ever film this concept that takes place on dozens of different scenes and with hundreds of different characters. And I closed it by saying, well, we have no idea, how George is coming with that project that he mentioned all those years ago, but we wish him luck. And that was probably the only Game of Thrones mention that was there.
Right. But I was fascinated to hear he had worked on comic strips and fanzines with Jim Starlin and things like that. So
yes, he did. Some of his early,
realize how interconnected all these things were.
Star-Studded Comics, which was published by the Texas Trio, was an early fanzine in 1965. He actually won an Alley Award for the best fan writing back then. Far more important than all the Hugo Awards that he ended up winning. And in fact, someday I have a copy of his first published fanzine, and someday I will. I have not gotten him to autograph anything, but someday I think I will have him autograph that. Sadly, Paulo, I don't know what happened to John Warner. No, I haven't kept in touch with him. I don't know that we're not friends on Facebook, I don't think, so I don't know where he went. You'll have to do a deep internet search on your own with that. But so I ended up getting out of comics, went to Clarion, Focus, just to sort of bring it home with that. You know, when you say that I said, you know, that the working in comics was the worst job, you know, that I ever had, I know there was a long period of having been bitter about my time in comics. I worked through that. Doing something like writing all the ethics columns, writing the ethics columns that I wrote for the Comics Journal. I wrote 6 or 7 of them, processing my time in comics and my feelings about the negative feelings that I had at the time. And you know, I no longer feel that way. You know, I definitely had bad feelings at the time because I think it did delay my fruition as a prose writer because of all the years trying to be Stan Lee. I also, one negative feeling about the comics, again, is my own immaturity. I mentioned the Archie Goodwin anecdote earlier on. I never tried to be myself in comics. I was always either trying to pretend to be Stan Lee or pretend to be Roy Thomas pretending to be Stan Lee. So everything I wrote was an echo of an echo, and that I never did what Don McGregor did and what Steve Gerber did, who changed. If you look at Don McGregor, I think, never tried to be anybody but Don McGregor. If you look at even his early Warren stuff, he was fully formed, saying, I'm going to bend the comics to my own will. Steve Gerber, if you look at the early things he wrote Submariner, I think, back at the beginning. And it was very clear that he was just, you know, okay, I'm being Roy Thomas or Stan Lee, I'm writing the Marvel way. And he eventually said, no, enough of this. I'm doing Man-Thing and Howard the Duck and all these weird comics that were comics only he could have written. And I never wrote, I think, a comic only I could have written. What that would have been had I continued on, I have no idea. But that was one of the things about my time in comics that if there is any regret about it, is those 2 things: my reaction to Archie that time and my never having written a comic that only Scott Edelman could have written.
Right. Would you be tempted, someone somewhere asked if you'd write a zombie graphic novel. Would you be tempted to do some kind of more independent type of work where you just did a graphic novel, you found an artist and took one of your ideas? And would that tempt you if the things happened the right way? Or would you be happy just never doing comics again?
Well, the thing is, the fun I had in comics, I think, was the fun of playing with other people's toys. Playing with the action figures that meant so much to me as a kid.
So you don't use them as a venue for originals.
So I don't think anything that I would do originally, I would do in prose form. I would not want to collaborate. The reason I would write a comic book is because I would say, boy, I would like to write a team up between Bat-Mite and Mixes-Pitalik. You know, I would like to have fun writing a silly story. I would like to write a Prez. I would like to, you know, there would be some weird story that no one has fully explored in a bizarre way, but then do it in an odd way. That would be the way I would do it. But you know, those would be the things, you know, that would tempt me. Writing these, some of these strange oddball characters. Sure, I would like to write something about the Impossible Man, the comic book. My favorite issue of the Fantastic Four, which is Fantastic Four number 11. Not to slight the Galactus trilogy. I saw a long time ago someone mentioned the Galactus trilogy, which I loved. But if I had to pick a single issue of the Fantastic Four, it might have to be, it's a competition between number 51, This Man, This Monster, and Fantastic Four number 11 with the Impossible Man and the Fantastic Four answer readers' letters. I think number 11 for me, as a kid reading that, would be a definite win.
But so you did eventually come back to reading comics, and by the time you were editing Science Fiction Age, you were pretty knowledgeable about the current comics at the time, because I did a few articles for you, and like you had a piece of Moon Shadow that you lent me so that I could review it.
I think, did you review like a Terry Bisson comic book too? Was it like Nightcrawlers or something? Did Terry Bisson write a comic? I don't remember if that was you or someone else. Well, what I became...
I wrote 5 or 6 comic reviews for you, but I don't recall that one.
What I became more than someone who read a lot of comics was someone who knew everything about comics. The same way I read Entertainment Weekly, so even if I don't listen to all the music and watch every movie and watch every TV show, you can't catch me unawares. When you mention something, I know that it exists and I might not have time to read it all. So I would devour previews every issue. And so I would know everything that was coming out and who was working on in the field, and would sort of dip in to see what was happening. But most of my comic book reading ends up being nostalgia reading. I go back and reread Watchmen. I go back and reread DC's Wasteland. I reread Moonshadow. I do reread Megaton Man. And occasional other old comics. Right now, lately, I have been rereading old-timey mystery and horror. I read all of Tales of Suspense and all of those, Tales to Astonish, not the superhero ones. I'm reading all the monster books, and I've been doing this context-free comic book panel of the day, and I've been reading.
What media do you read them? Digitally, or do you have the originals? Or
I've been reading them digitally, and I've been just going back to every comic book in all possible online way I can find it. The sites that are collect the out of copyright comics that no one bothered with. The weirder ones are even weirder than the early Marvel and DC ones and the ACG ones. I started off with Marvel and DC and ACG now, and now I've been going through all the others because there's always a panel that just stands out as being extremely weird on its own, particularly if you don't explain what kind of story was going to come after that panel and what it could possibly have meant. So that's my main comic book reading at the moment.
Do you think that's part of your subconscious stuff, goes into your subconscious and gets in the mix that then comes out into your own fiction?
I don't know. I haven't been able to see that happen yet. No, I haven't. Never made a one-to-one connection. I mean, only one or two dreams ever made it into a short story of mine. So the worlds are really two separate things. So I haven't seen that happen yet. But I pay attention to comics. I still love comics. I guess the last, I love the Alan Moore. Was it 1964? Was that what was it called? 1965? 1963. That's right. It was called. Wasn't it called 1963?
That's only 25 years ago.
Yes, when he took Image Comics and did these Marvel style comics, even with fake letter pages. That were trying to stand like Stan Lee, so there was that. So unfortunately, I don't do as much comic reading as I normally do. I enjoy watching you when you do here are the 20 best comics I read in the last week from the latest poll, because it gives me one
of your sources of info now. Have you
tried? I often watch you while I'm on the treadmill or something like that.
Have you dipped into Saga at all? That was kind of the big comic of the last 10 years, I'd say.
I have not yet. I wish I could remember the last new thing that I read, and I cannot remember. I love Bill Sienkiewicz. I still have the Elektra standalone series he did, which was an extremely surreal. And there's someone whose evolution from pretending to be someone else to becoming himself is magnificent. Because so many artists, I apologize if you hear the phone ring, maybe it's being blurred out by these headphones, I don't know. But there's someone, if you look back, so many artists pretended to be someone else. Either they were pretending to be Jack Kirby or they were pretending to be Neil Adams. And if you look at those early Moon Knights, Bill Sienkiewicz was very much, I'm going to be Neil Adams. Just the moves, the poses. He had obviously ingested Neil Adams, and Neil Adams is wonderful. The dynamic of Neil Adams revolutionizing the field back then. But to see him suddenly become himself and say, I'm going to do things the way I want to, whether it was, let's see, I don't know which came first, whether New Mutants, he was starting to do interesting things, but I know the Daredevil, but the Elektra miniseries I really remember as the most surreal thing that he was doing. Now, am I remember correctly that he was big numbers with Alan Moore, and they only got through what, 2 issues, I think?
Yeah, I don't know what went wrong there.
I think they only got 2, but that was a very large-sized square comic book, and I remember that.
Yeah.
So I was very much into seeing people do the things that only they could do, as opposed to following along. I remember loving, of course, we're talking about 30-year-old things by now. I remember reading Concrete and loving Concrete. You know, that was something that was different and very twee, and you know, you didn't see that in the Marvel style or DC style. I'm no longer interested in a house style. You know, I'm interested in, you know, what can people do that only they could do, and therefore, yes, if someone said, oh, you know, gee, we'd want you to, you know, write a one shot of something. You know, who would you write about? What weird little character thing would you do? Maybe it would be fun to do one, because I'm often on comic panels where you've got the people who do it now, the people who have did it in the aughts, the people in the 90s, someone from the 70s, and then I was there before Stan Lee had hair, as we often say, because, you know, I was there when he went from going from a toupee to hair plugs, because he moved to California and was, these toupees are hot. I don't want to do this anymore. And then he got hair plugs. So, you know, that's how we knew him with the toupee thing.
Did you see him jump up on tables, or was he done with that by the time you got
He was not doing that, but it was not apocryphal. I knew the people who had seen him do it and said, no, he really would do it. He would really jump. Marie Severin had seen it. Johnny Romita Sr. would say that he did it. And so it happened. I Am Not Spock is asking if comics today have as much impact as they did in the past for kids. I don't see how they possibly can, because they were not your sole method of seeing superheroes back then. The cinematic universe rules the comics at the moment. If you wanted to see the Hulk and Thing beat the crap out of each other for 20 pages, you know, it had to be in a comic book. And I mean, just look at the sales. I mean, back then you could have a comic book canceled because it only sold 200,000 or 300,000 copies, and now, what if you sell 70,000? Is that would be a bestseller now? I think. I'm not quite sure where we are in the numbers, but, you know, watching the drop and drop and drop over the past 50 years is amazing. So I don't think certainly comic book culture has more influence now over the entire world than it has ever had. I never thought I'd be able to turn on a television and see, look, there's 20 hours of comic book television going on now. Green Arrow and The Flash and, you know, Archie and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, you know, amazing. I began slowly with Smallville, and what a thrill it was to say, look, the Legion of Superheroes, Dr. Fate, what the heck are they doing here? You know, and if you had asked anybody back then, would some of the biggest characters be Rocket Raccoon and Groot? I would never have believed that would be possible. But there's no character so small or so C-list, as far as we were concerned, that someone had not figured out a way to make a Doom Patrol, a TV show. I would never have thought that. I've watched Doom Patrol recently. That's a good show. But anyway, we could go on forever about all this.
We could.
You know?
So, well, you know, I kind of wish I had a channel with science fiction readers too. I would love to discuss your career afterward sometime in another video, but we'll probably have less viewers. But if you ever want to do that, talk about your editing and writing career.
Oh, anytime. Also, the fanish careers as they intertwine. Because just to end at the beginning, my first convention was 1970. My first comic book convention. My first science fiction convention was 1971 at a Lunicon in New York. My first Star Trek convention was the first Star Trek convention, 1972 in New York. And my first World Science Fiction Convention was 1974 in Washington, D.C. And time folds into itself. We'll just end with that. That I, in 1971, was sitting in a room with Chip Delaney, who wrote some comics as well. Samuel R. Delaney wrote some wonderful novels and wrote comic books as well. And 45 years later, I think I was at a convention where someone was showing a documentary about Chip Delaney. And I was sitting in the front row, as I always am, as I told you at the beginning. There was one empty seat next to me. And into the room hobbles Chip Delaney and sits down next to me. We were sitting next to each other in 1971 at a convention, and there we were sitting next to each other probably in, 2015. And this documentary begins to play. And it has footage of Chip Delaney in the mid-70s. And I'm sitting next to Chip Delaney. I was with Chip Delaney in the mid-70s, and I'm sitting next to him now. And time just collapsed onto itself.
So, yeah.
So if you're in this thing, if you go to conventions as I do, and you've met almost everyone during a certain period of time who ever worked in comics, everything happens all at once. I'm like Dr. Manhattan. It's all happening at once, Damien. The convention from 1970 and our conversation now is all happening at once. So I do from time to time have that bizarre feeling of nostalgia and not feeling it was very long ago. But yes, but the science fiction is part of that as well.
Well, everyone, I have linked a link to Scott's webpage and the podcast part of it. You can look for the podcast, which I think help you get this whole sense of time folding in on itself and the importance of conventions for the shape of Scott's life.
Right. And the most recent episodes of the podcast are me answering listener questions, since people are not available to sit at a table, since the conceit is we have a meal in a restaurant and eat. So go back further from that if you're into comics, and look for Jerry Conway, Paul Levitz, Mark Evanier, Larry Lieber, all those folks, and give those folks a listen. I think I got some good information out of them, good memories.
Right. And if you're into science fiction or other prose, there's a lot of good stuff there too. I loved one of, not too recent, I guess, but the Ramsey Campbell interview really stuck with me. I like that a lot.
Ramsey Campbell, one of the greatest horror writers we have, and one of the most listened to episodes I have is with a writer named Ted Klein, T.E.D. Klein, who wrote These Ceremonies, which was a best-selling horror novel, one of the first big, fat, thick best-selling horror novels, who was somewhat hermit-like, and he was willing to sit down with me and answer questions. So I know a lot of people are, and he was the editor of the Twilight Zone magazine. Yeah, so anyway, I'll answer that last question, then we can all part. Okay, someone I would have liked to work to. I was caricatured many times by Marie Severin, but we never had a chance to work with Marie Severin. And that actually is another question that someone asked me on the podcast. Now that I think of it, if I ever wrote another comic book, it would have been wonderful to write an autobiographical comic book of my time at Marvel, illustrated by Marie Severin.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you track down that Foom cover, and as you should all do, track down the cover of Foom, which is the character of every single person who worked at Marvel Comics in 1975, beautifully caricatured. She would have done a wonderful job. It would have been great to work with her. But anyway, we could go on for our entire lives having this conversation. I don't know how much of me people are willing to put up with.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me, and perhaps we will have you back at some point in the future. And everyone, just check out his podcast and his books, and we'll talk again soon.
That would be wonderful. Everybody stay safe out there.